Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm continuing today with my series, probably going to be kind of a long series in the end, responding to Gregor and Blais' article, which is itself a critique of Richard Baucham's name statistics argument. Today, I'm going to talk about their idea of a chance hypothesis and their repeated statement that the Gospels are not really doing significantly better than chance at matching the name statistics in Tal Ilan's database of male Palestinian names. And there's a lot to say about that. My intention is actually to release two recordings here on the same day because they're closely related. And I find it hard to cut in the middle, but I don't want any one of them to get too long. So I'm going to start by explaining, once again, the distinction between names and occurrences in Ilan's database and in the Gospels, other samples you might take of names. So a name can have more than one occurrence. There are 451 names in Tal Ilan, even when you take out the so-called 53 contested persons. There are 451 names, but there are over 2,100 occurrences because one name could be used to name more than one person or to be a second name to more than one person. Sometimes a person might have a second name as well as a first name. We'll talk about that at a later time. But there's your difference between names and occurrences. Now, Gregor and Blais put together a model that they call a chance model, and they call it the most extreme alternative to Baucham's idea that these were coming from known people who had access to what had really happened rather than anonymous community transmission. So they say, well, let's do the most extreme version of anonymous community transmission. They make it clear that they really think they're being generous by doing this because they don't think that this extreme hypothesis is what you would really see, even if someone were making up the names. And I'll talk about some of those other alternatives that they think are actually more plausible. But they say, hey, let's construct a really extreme chance hypothesis in an act of generosity. And then if we say that the Gospels and Acts are scarcely or not doing even any better than that really extreme chance hypothesis, then, all the more so if you had inventors who knew something about Palestinian name statistics, they could be making stuff up and do even better than the Gospels and Acts. So this is sort of their, you might call it granting something for the sake of the argument that, if someone were making it up, he would be engaging in a very extreme version of random modeling. So for this purpose, they construct a random model. And this is a bag or an urn down here. This is a randomizing model that supposedly fares no worse than the Gospels and Acts do. And in this urn, you have the 451 names that are found in Ilan, and they're all equally weighted. So it's as though you had 451 balls in that urn, and each one has a different name on it. They each have 1 out of 451 chances of being drawn. And then you reach in and you draw one out, you look at the name, you write that down, you throw it back in, you shake it, and you reach in again, etc. For an n-fold sample, whatever your n might happen to be. they're talking about a 53-fold sample because, as you remember, they're, taking away 26 names from, 26 persons, 26 occurrences from Balcom's list because they're separately attested. We talked about why that's wrong to do before. So then it's a 53-fold sample. Balcom would be using 79 persons, so to try to sort of match that, if you were trying to imitate what he's doing, it would be a 79-fold sample. I would argue for possibly 83 because I would include some of the deacons in Acts that are not explicitly said to be from outside of Palestine. I would say, well, prima facie, they're from inside, but 83 and 79, those are really close. Okay, so how many ever times to get a sample? And then they're going to compare what we would expect from a sample that we get in that manner, from this flat distribution, with what we find in Ilan and with what we find in the Gospels and Acts. And they're going to argue that to a very great extent, even if you got the sample in this really, really random way with no weighting at all, it would be very similar to what we find in the Gospels and Acts. Okay, so that gives you some idea of what they're doing. Now, I want to say something here about their idea that that's the most extreme form of a randomization invention hypothesis, where someone is just pulling out a name and then he's gonna make up a story and he's gonna give a name to a person in that story and he's just inventing it, drawn at random from 451 names. Now remember, these 451 names are names that Ilan found attested among Palestinian Jews during the relevant time period. Okay? Why would we think it would only be those 451? Why, if we're going to say over and over again, this is the most extreme version of random invention, why restrict it to Palestinian Jewish names? Balcom is often talking about the possibility of someone living outside of that region who is inventing, and he's saying, it would be hard for someone who's living outside of the place and the time and the community there in first century Palestine to get these name statistics right. So if someone's in that circumstance, how and why, even as he's just randomizing, is he going to limit himself just to the Jewish Palestinian male names? So I think if you're going to say that you're doing a most extreme version of chance invention, it should be bigger. I'm not sure how much bigger, but potentially a lot bigger. And something that was pointed out to me by Luc Van de Vey, and I want to give him credit here, was that someone in that circumstance who's making stuff up might not even restrict himself to Jewish names. And one reason we can see for this is that even in Ilan's database, when you have Greek names, there's not a little asterisk by him. Philip just looks like Philip. It's just a Greek name that sometimes Jews used. Marcus is just Marcus. It's a Latin name that sometimes Jews use. So if you're not in that place and time and you're not telling true stories about real people, part of the question is how would you know to avoid using Greek and Latin names that Jews didn't use? Okay, so there could be easily an influx of completely non-Jewish names, way beyond that 451. So I wanted to say that right at the beginning. They think that they're constructing this very extreme scenario. I don't think it's nearly extreme enough. But for the rest of my presentation on this no better than chance claim, I'm going to just move beyond that and talk about this randomization flat scenario with just the 451. I found that I had so much to say about that I decided not to make a whole video just on the claim that that's the most extreme, and that a person outside would only be accessing those names. They say in a footnote that Bauckham has somehow granted something that allows them to limit an inventor to just those Palestinian names, and I've looked up their references in Bauckham. I don't think he says anything that allows them to do that and restrict it to those. So I think Bauckham should come back and say that's not the most extreme if somebody's outside of that milieu entirely. All right. Now, what they do is that they insist that there's way too much overlap between what we would expect to get in this flat random way and what we find in the Gospels and Acts. And they even say that if a name only occurs once in the Gospels and Acts, it's completely uninformative, because you would only expect something to appear 0 or 1 times in an n-fold sample where it's randomizing over these 451. So they say that's just white noise. But interestingly, at the same time, they complain that there are too few rare names in the Gospels and Acts, and I'll be dealing with that in the other part of today's discussion, that rareness, that it actually really comes back at them. But here I just want to point out that you can't have it both ways. If the single occurrence names are white noise, we shouldn't even bother. We shouldn't look at how many of them there are, or, what pattern they form or anything like that. Then you can't turn around and say that something about those single occurrence names in the Gospels and Acts is evidence against them. It's either uninformative or it isn't. So right away, they're kind of trying to have it both ways. Now, what I want to talk about right now is they're failing to look at the overall shape of the data, something I've mentioned before, the shape of the data, because those of us who are making the name statistics argument are arguing from that shape. If you look even at their figure 1, where they've got the Ilan data, it's got this swoopy shape. Swoopy is not a technical term. Statisticians sometimes talk about a Pareto distribution or Pareto-like, but I would prefer swoopy because it's not so technical. But basically what you have is you have a relatively small number of names that are the high part of the graph, and that occur over and over again, and then it gets somewhat less and then it's this long sort of tailing off. And you find that. You can see it in Table 6, even in Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Your first 9 names have a huge bulk, like they're ranked by popularity in Ilan. They have this huge bulk of occurrences, okay? And then the next, say, 3, 10, 11, and 12, I call those Tier B. I call the first ones Tier A, the next one Tier B. They have somewhat more, and then there's this sort of jump, and then it takes another jump, and once you get to 13th place or so, you start getting ties, okay? And then somewhere in the 20s, it takes another jump, and then it's just going down, a bunch of ties that are 9, and then 8, and then 7 and 6, and it's just going down very slowly like this, okay? So it's got that to it, and obviously, if you're drawing from 451 names, you're drawing, say, a 79-fold sample with replacement, it's going to just be like a flat carpet on a floor. It's not going to look swoopy, of course. That's the whole point of making it. That's why we call it a flat distribution. For, most of the 451 names, it'd be 0. You wouldn't pick them at all. And then you'd have a little boop, 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 of one name showing up. And it would be spread across. If it's representative, it would be spread across the whole gamut of names because they're not weighted by popularity at all. So it lacks the shape of the data. But the Gospels and Acts do reflect that swoopy shape. And they do it, moreover, with specific names that are in Tier A and Tier B of Ilan's list. So you've got Simon, Joseph, Judas, John, James. James is somewhat overrepresented. I'll be talking about that a little bit more when I talk about disambiguation down the line here. But the high repetition, the high occurrence names are your Tier A and Tier B names from Ilan. Of course, it's going to stop being high representation at a certain point. Why? Well, because it is in Ilan also. So Gregor and Blais say, well, only a few of the most frequently occurring names are even candidates for comparison. Well, that's a kind of invidious way of putting it. What would be more true to say would be, oh, look, they've got a few names, relatively few names, with a whole bunch of occurrences, and so does Ilan. Okay? Let me put it this way. With the exception of Herod, there is no Tier C or lower name in the Gospels that occurs more than two times. I'm going to say that again. With the exception of the name Herod, there is no name that is Tier C or lower in Ilan that occurs more than twice in the Gospels and Acts. You find Herod somewhat overrepresented in Josephus as well, as actually Gregor and Blais actually show that. You can actually see that in one of their figures, and probably for the same reason that both Josephus and the writers of the Gospels are interested in telling about rulers. Luke especially is. So Herod, the name, is somewhat overrepresented in the Gospels. But other than that, you don't find some low-level name that has, only a few representations in Ilan that's got, 6 or 7 or 8 occurrences in the Gospels. And so that's like what struck Bauckham. That's, in a sense, the core of the name statistics argument, and is obviously not reflected in that completely flat shape. So that's the first point. They're not seeing the forest for the trees. They're imagining something that looks flat, and then they're saying, oh, well, this isn't doing notably worse than the Gospels and Acts, where the Gospels and Acts don't look flat, and they don't look flat in the very similar way to the way that Ilan's distribution doesn't look flat. We'll be right back.